behind him stretches the most powerful naval strike force in history. 4 fleet carriers packed with Japan's finest pilots, battleships bristling with 14-inch guns, cruisers and destroyers forming a steel wall across the ocean. These are the same ships that obliterated Pearl Harbor just 6 months ago. The same pilots who crushed the Royal Navy in the Indian Ocean, who sent the Prince of Wales and Repulse to the bottom off Malaysia. For decades, Japanese naval doctrine has dominated the Pacific. Their carrier tactics are textbook perfect, their formations unbreakable, their discipline absolute. But what Admiral Nagumo doesn't know, what none of his staff officers suspect, is that everything they believe about naval warfare is about to be shattered by an enemy they've consistently underestimated. American carrier tactics that exist nowhere in Japanese military manuals. Fighting methods so unconventional, so brutally effective, that they'll leave Japan's greatest admirals staring at their burning ships in complete disbelief. Today, we're diving deep into the moment when American naval innovation collided with Japanese tradition and changed the course of World War II forever. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why Japan's most experienced admirals couldn't comprehend what was happening to their fleets, how American commanders threw out centuries of naval warfare principles and created something entirely new, something that would hunt Japanese carriers across the Pacific like wolves stalking deer. But first, let me paint you a picture of just how dominant Japanese naval power seemed in 1942. Picture this: the Imperial Japanese Navy hadn't lost a major engagement in over 40 years. Their carrier doctrine was copied by every navy in the world. When Japanese admirals planned operations, they expected victory as surely as the sun rises. Their confidence wasn't arrogance, it was mathematical certainty, based on decades of unbroken success. Admiral Nagumo himself had led the Pearl Harbor strike force. He'd watched American battleships burn and sink while losing only 29 aircraft. His pilots were veterans with thousands of hours of combat experience. His ships were the finest engineering Japan could produce. His tactics had been perfected through years of war games and actual combat across the Pacific. Standing beside him on Akagi's bridge, Commander Minoru Genda reviews the morning's intelligence reports. American forces are somewhere in these waters, but Japanese reconnaissance has failed to locate them precisely. No matter. When the Americans are found, they'll face the combined might of 4 carriers launching coordinated strikes with clockwork precision. This is how Japanese carriers fight: massed formations, overwhelming firepower, textbook execution. Every pilot knows his role. Every ship maintains perfect formation. When they strike, it's like a sword cutting through silk. Clean, efficient, devastating. The Americans learned this lesson at Pearl Harbor, at Wake Island, in the Philippines. Everywhere Japanese carriers appear, American ships burn and sink. But 800 miles away, something unprecedented is happening aboard the American carrier Enterprise. Admiral Raymond Spruance stands in the flag plot, studying radar contacts that shouldn't exist according to every naval warfare manual ever written. His task force isn't behaving like carriers are supposed to behave. They're not maintaining tight formations. They're not following doctrine. They're doing something that would horrify Japanese admirals if they could see it. They're improvising. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey peers through his dive bomber's canopy, leading a strike group that's operating on incomplete intelligence, outdated positions, and pure instinct. His pilots haven't trained for decades like their Japanese counterparts. Most barely have a year of combat experience. Their aircraft are newer but less proven. By every measure of traditional naval warfare, they should be hopelessly outmatched. But here's what the Japanese don't understand about American naval tactics in 1942. They're not fighting by anyone's rules, not even their own. American carrier doctrine, such as it exists, was written by men who'd never seen modern naval combat. The textbooks gathering dust at the Naval War College describe orderly engagements between evenly matched fleets, with careful positioning and methodical strikes. Gentlemanly warfare between professional navies following internationally recognized principles. The reality unfolding in the Pacific is nothing like those textbooks. American commanders are making it up as they go along, adapting to situations no military academy ever taught them to handle. They're using radar in ways that confuse Japanese observers. They're coordinating strikes across hundreds of miles of ocean using communication methods that seem chaotic to traditionally trained minds. Most shocking of all to Japanese sensibilities, American carriers are operating independently. Where Japanese doctrine demands tight formation flying and coordinated group attacks, American squadrons are scattered across the Pacific, hunting targets individually, striking when opportunity presents itself, rather than waiting for perfect tactical coordination. To Admiral Nagumo, this looks like amateur incompetence, undisciplined cowboys playing at naval warfare. But what he's actually witnessing is the birth of a completely new form of maritime combat, one that will prove devastatingly effective against traditional Japanese methods. Captain Mark Mitchell, commanding the carrier Hornet, embodies this new American approach. His ship is operating alone, hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly vessel. His pilots are launching strikes based on fragmentary intelligence and educated guesses. By Japanese standards, this is tactical suicide. By American standards, it's aggressive opportunism. The philosophical difference runs deeper than tactics. Japanese naval officers are trained to execute perfect plans flawlessly. Their entire military culture revolves around precision, discipline, and adherence to proven methods. When something unexpected happens, they adapt within established parameters. They improve existing techniques rather than abandoning them entirely. American naval officers, particularly the younger generation commanding in the Pacific, approach problems differently. When existing methods don't work, they discard them. When doctrine proves inadequate, they write new doctrine in real time. When traditional formations prove vulnerable, they create formations that exist nowhere in any manual. This isn't necessarily better or worse than the Japanese approach. It's simply fundamentally different. And in the chaotic environment of Pacific naval warfare, that difference is about to prove decisive. Back aboard Akagi, Admiral Nagumo receives reports that American carriers have been located. His staff begins planning the coordinated strike that will eliminate American naval power in the Pacific once and for all. Every detail is calculated. Every timing sequence is precise. The attack will unfold with the mechanical perfection that has made Japanese carrier aviation the terror of the Pacific. But as his staff officers plot courses and calculate fuel loads, none of them suspect that their enemy isn't playing by the same rules. That American carriers are already launching strikes based not on careful planning, but on desperate improvisation. That American pilots are flying missions that violate every principle of sound naval aviation, and that this apparent chaos is about to collide with Japanese precision in a battle that will leave the Imperial Navy's finest admirals staring at the impossible, watching their perfect formations torn apart by an enemy fighting with methods they cannot comprehend. The stage is set for a confrontation between two completely different philosophies of naval warfare: traditional Japanese excellence versus American innovation, proven methods versus desperate experimentation. And what happens next will determine not just who controls the Pacific, but how naval battles will be fought for the next century. Because sometimes the side that breaks all the rules is the side that writes history. The first hint that something is terribly wrong comes at 7:05 a.m. when Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga's reconnaissance aircraft radios back a contact report that makes no sense to anyone in the Japanese fleet. American carriers detected bearing northeast, distance 240 miles. But they're not where they should be according to every intelligence estimate. They're not in formation. They're not behaving like carriers are supposed to behave. Commander Genda studies the plot board with growing confusion. The American ships are scattered across 50 miles of ocean, moving in patterns that violate every principle of carrier warfare. Where are their screening vessels? Why aren't they maintaining defensive formations? This looks less like a naval task force and more like individual ships wandering aimlessly across the Pacific. It has to be a mistake. American carriers don't operate this way. No Navy operates this way. But 800 miles northeast, Admiral Spruance is orchestrating something the Japanese military mind cannot fathom. His carriers aren't scattered by accident or incompetence. They're positioned for maximum flexibility, ready to strike from multiple directions simultaneously. It's organized chaos that looks like disorder to traditionally trained observers. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron grips his torpedo bomber's controls, leading Torpedo Squadron 8 toward what intelligence suggests is the main Japanese carrier force. His 15 aircraft are flying alone, unsupported by fighters or dive bombers. By Japanese standards, this is tactical insanity. Torpedo attacks require coordinated strikes with overwhelming force to succeed. But Waldron isn't following Japanese standards. He's not even following American standards, because American standards for this kind of warfare don't exist yet. He's improvising, adapting, making decisions based on intuition and incomplete information that would horrify staff officers trained in methodical planning. Behind him, his pilots maintain loose formations that allow for individual maneuvering. When they encounter enemy fighters, they won't fight as a rigid unit. They'll scatter, regroup, adapt to circumstances as they develop. It's controlled pandemonium that looks like amateur hour to observers accustomed to precise military choreography. Admiral Nagumo watches through his binoculars as the first American aircraft appear on the horizon. 15 torpedo bombers approaching without fighter escort, without coordinated support, without any apparent tactical plan beyond flying straight at his carriers and hoping for the best. His experienced eye immediately recognizes what he's seeing. Suicide. Pure, simple suicide. His staff officers exchange glances that mix professional contempt with genuine puzzlement. Are these Americans completely insane? Do they understand nothing about naval aviation? Sending 15 unescorted bombers against 4 carriers, protected by dozens of Zero fighters, is beyond tactical incompetence. It's military suicide dressed up as an attack. But as Waldron's torpedoes streak toward Akagi, something unprecedented happens in Japanese naval experience. The attack fails completely, just as doctrine predicts. All 15 American aircraft are shot down. Not one torpedo finds its mark. Japanese losses are 0. Victory is absolute and textbook perfect. Yet somehow, this perfect Japanese defensive success creates the conditions for their own destruction. Because while Nagumo's fighters are massacring Torpedo Squadron 8 at sea level, they're not watching the sky above. While his gun crews are tracking low-flying torpedo bombers, they're not scanning for dive bombers approaching from high altitude. The American attack that looked so amateurish, so poorly coordinated, has drawn every Japanese defensive asset down to wave-top level. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey circling at 14,000 feet with 33 dive bombers, watches the slaughter below and realizes what his orders have accidentally accomplished. The Japanese fleet is completely focused on the torpedo attack. Their fighters are down low. Their anti-aircraft guns are depressed for surface targets. The sky above the Japanese carriers is empty. McCluskey doesn't hesitate. He doesn't radio for permission. He doesn't wait for coordination with other squadrons. He rolls his Dauntless into a 70-degree dive toward the carrier Kaga and commits his entire squadron to an attack that exists nowhere in American tactical doctrine. Because there is no American tactical doctrine for this situation, no manual explains how to coordinate accidental attacks by different squadrons arriving at different times from different directions. No textbook describes how to exploit the confusion created by seemingly failed torpedo runs. McCluskey is making it up as he dives, creating new tactical methods in real time, while Japanese gunners frantically try to elevate their weapons to engage targets coming from an unexpected direction. Admiral Nagumo watches in absolute horror as American dive bombers materialize out of empty sky and begin systematically destroying his carriers. This isn't happening. This can't be happening. American naval aviation isn't sophisticated enough to coordinate complex multi-axis attacks. Their pilots lack the training. Their doctrine lacks the precision. Yet somehow, impossibly, his perfect formations are dissolving under attacks that seem to come from everywhere at once. Kaga erupts in flames as McCluskey's bombs detonate among aircraft being fueled and armed on the hangar deck. Secondary explosions tear through the ship's hull as aviation fuel ignites in chain reactions that consume everything combustible. Within minutes, Japan's newest fleet carrier is transformed from an instrument of precision warfare into a floating funeral pyre. But the nightmare is just beginning, because while Nagumo's attention is fixed on Kaga's death agony, more American squadrons are arriving from directions that make no tactical sense. Dive bombers from Enterprise, torpedo planes from Yorktown, fighters from Hornet, all attacking independently without apparent coordination, creating a three-dimensional battle space that Japanese defensive doctrine never anticipated. Commander Genda stares at the tactical display in growing panic. American attacks are coming from 4 different compass bearings simultaneously. Their aircraft are operating at 6 different altitudes. Some squadrons are attacking in formation, while others have split into individual hunting pairs. This isn't naval aviation as the Japanese understand it. This is aerial chaos that somehow produces devastating results through methods that appear completely random to traditionally trained observers. The carrier Akagi shudders as American bombs penetrate her flight deck and explode among the aircraft spotted for the next strike. Planes that were supposed to eliminate American naval power in the Pacific become fuel for fires that consume Japan's flagship carrier from within. Admiral Nagumo, his uniform singed by blast fragments, watches his meticulously planned operation disintegrate under attacks that violate every principle of sound tactical doctrine. American pilots are fighting like individual warriors rather than disciplined units. Their coordination appears accidental. Their success seems impossible. Yet his carriers are burning. The flames climbing Akagi's superstructure cast dancing shadows across Admiral Nagumo's face as he struggles to comprehend what his 40 years of naval experience cannot explain. His carriers aren't just burning, they're being systematically dismantled by an enemy fighting with methods that exist nowhere in his understanding of warfare. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey pulls his dive bomber out of its attack run, banking hard to avoid the geysers of anti-aircraft fire erupting around his aircraft. Behind him, the carrier Kaga is a blazing wreck, her flight deck buckled and twisted like crumpled paper. But McCluskey isn't celebrating. He's already scanning the horizon for his next target, his mind calculating angles and fuel loads with the cold precision of a factory foreman organizing an assembly line. This is what Japanese admirals cannot fathom about American carrier tactics. There's no glory in it, no honor, no adherence to the elegant principles that have governed naval warfare for centuries. American pilots approach combat like mechanics, fixing a broken machine. Identify the problem, apply the most efficient solution, move to the next problem. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who led the Pearl Harbor attack, clutches a pair of binoculars with hands that shake from more than just the concussions rocking his ship. Through the smoke and flame, he watches American aircraft methodically working over the Japanese fleet with an industrial efficiency that chills him to the bone. These aren't the panic-stricken Americans who fled Wake Island and Guam. These pilots attack with a systematic thoroughness that treats Japanese carriers not as proud symbols of naval power, but as targets to be eliminated with maximum efficiency and minimum waste of ammunition. Aboard the carrier Soryu, Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto stands on his bridge watching the impossible unfold before his eyes. American dive bombers are attacking his ship from 3 different directions simultaneously, not because they planned coordinated strikes, but because individual squadron commanders are making independent decisions based on tactical opportunities that develop in real time. This flexibility horrifies traditionally trained Japanese officers. Where is the command structure? Where is the unified battle plan? How can naval aviation function without centralized control and predetermined attack sequences? The answer screams down from 14,000 feet in the form of Lieutenant Dick Best's dive bomber, its engine howling as it accelerates toward Soryu's flight deck. Best isn't following orders radioed from a flagship. He's not executing a predetermined attack plan developed by staff officers studying charts in air-conditioned plotting rooms. He's making tactical decisions based on what he sees through his windscreen. Soryu's fighters are out of position. Her anti-aircraft guns are masked by the ship's own superstructure. Her flight deck is crowded with aircraft being prepared for strikes that will never launch. Best's bombs penetrate Soryu's wooden flight deck and detonate in the hangar space below, triggering explosions that rip through the ship's hull like a string of firecrackers. Within minutes, Japan's 3rd Fleet carrier is transformed from a floating airfield into a blazing monument to the effectiveness of improvised American tactics. Admiral Yamaguchi, commanding Carrier Division 2 from the bridge of Hiryu, watches 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers burn simultaneously and experiences something no Japanese naval officer has felt since the Russo-Japanese War. Complete tactical bewilderment. His training, his experience, his entire understanding of naval warfare provides no framework for comprehending what he's witnessing. American carrier aviation appears chaotic, undisciplined, completely lacking in the coordination that makes effective naval strikes possible. Yet somehow, this apparent chaos is systematically destroying the most powerful naval strike force Japan has ever assembled. The mathematical impossibility of what's happening makes his head spin. 15 unescorted torpedo bombers should never have drawn down his fighter cover. Dive bombers arriving piecemeal from different directions should have been easily defeated by concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Individual American pilots making independent attack decisions should have resulted in scattered, ineffective strikes. Instead, his fleet is dying. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, flying a damaged bomber back toward what he hopes is still a functioning carrier, radios a contact report that captures the essence of Japanese confusion. American tactics appear completely disorganized, but results suggest coordination beyond our comprehension. That single transmission summarizes the psychological impact of American carrier warfare on the Japanese naval mind. How do you fight an enemy whose methods appear amateurish but produce results that surpass professional excellence? Back aboard Enterprise, Admiral Spruance receives damage reports from his strike squadrons with the emotional detachment of a businessman reviewing quarterly production figures. Aircraft losses are acceptable. Target damage is extensive. Mission parameters are being met within acceptable tolerances. His staff officers plot the next series of strikes with the methodical efficiency of men organizing a factory shift. No dramatic speeches about honor or glory. No appeals to ancestral traditions or imperial destiny. Just cold calculations about fuel loads, bomb weights, and target priorities. This industrial approach to naval warfare represents something entirely alien to Japanese military thinking. Where Japanese commanders see individual battles as tests of national character and military spirit, American commanders see tactical problems requiring efficient solutions. Commander Genda, his uniform torn and blackened by smoke, stumbles across Akagi's listing flight deck, trying to organize damage control parties. Around him, sailors fight fires with a discipline that would be admirable if it weren't so tragically futile. The carrier is doomed, but Japanese naval tradition demands they fight to save her until the very end. Meanwhile, American pilots circling overhead discuss their next attacks with the casual professionalism of construction workers planning how to demolish a building. No emotion, no hatred, just technical discussions about attack angles and defensive fire patterns. The contrast in military philosophy couldn't be more stark. Japanese sailors dying heroically to save ships that cannot be saved. American aviators calculating the most efficient methods for sinking ships that are already doomed. Captain Yanagimoto, standing on Soryu's burning bridge, faces the decision that defines the difference between Japanese and American naval culture. Traditional honor demands he go down with his ship. Practical survival suggests he abandon the vessel and preserve experienced leadership for future battles. He chooses honor, lashing himself to the ship's compass and singing the Japanese national anthem as Soryu's hull settles deeper into the Pacific. His death accomplishes nothing tactically, but it satisfies cultural requirements that American naval officers would consider counterproductive waste of trained personnel. In the end, what Japanese admirals witnessed at Midway wasn't just military defeat, it was the collision between two fundamentally different philosophies of warfare: traditional excellence versus industrial efficiency, honor-bound precision versus ruthless adaptability. The rigid discipline that had dominated Asia for decades shattered against American improvisation that turned chaos into victory. The burning carriers scattered across the Pacific that day marked more than Japan's first major naval defeat. They represented the death of centuries-old naval warfare principles and the birth of something entirely new. Something that would hunt Japanese fleets across the Pacific until the rising sun flag disappeared from the seas forever. The morning mist clings to Tokyo Bay like a funeral shroud as Captain Hiroshi Nakamura stands on the bridge of his cargo vessel, the Yamato Maru, watching the sunrise paint the water crimson. It's March 15th, 1944, and something has changed in the Pacific. Something that makes even veteran merchant sailors like Nakamura check their life preservers twice before leaving port. Behind him, 200 tons of desperately needed rice and medical supplies wait in the hold. Ahead lies a 400-mile voyage to the starving garrison at Truk. What should be a routine supply run has become a death sentence, and every man aboard knows it. The ocean that once belonged to Japan now crawls with American submarines, silent predators that strike without warning and vanish like ghosts. Nakamura adjusts his cap against the morning breeze, his weathered hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the knowledge that weighs on every Japanese merchant captain in 1944. They're not just delivering supplies anymore. They're feeding an empire that's slowly starving to death, and the Americans have figured out exactly how to tighten the noose. 6,000 miles away in Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant Commander Eugene Fluckey studies reconnaissance photographs with the cold precision of a surgeon examining X-rays. His submarine, the USS Barb, has just returned from its 5th war patrol, and the numbers tell a story that would make any strategist smile. 47 Japanese vessels sunk in the last 6 months. Oil tankers, cargo ships, troop transports, all sent to the bottom of the Pacific with methodical efficiency. But Fluckey isn't smiling. He understands what these numbers really mean. Every sunken ship represents not just military victory, but economic strangulation on a scale never before attempted in human history. The United States Navy isn't just fighting Japan's military. They're systematically destroying an entire nation's ability to survive. This is the story of how America's submarine force accomplished something no army in history had ever managed. They didn't just defeat Japan's military, they suffocated an entire empire, starving 70 million people into submission without firing a single shot at the home islands. And it all began with a radical strategic decision that would redefine naval warfare forever. Picture Japan in early 1944 as a massive organism that requires constant feeding to survive. Raw materials from Southeast Asia, oil from the Dutch East Indies, food from Korea and Manchuria, all flowing through maritime arteries that stretch across thousands of miles of ocean. Remove those supply lines, and the organism begins to die. Slowly, agonizingly, but inevitably. American naval strategists had recognized this vulnerability even before Pearl Harbor. Japan was an island nation completely dependent on imports for survival. Cut those imports, and military victory becomes irrelevant, because the civilian population simply cannot sustain the war effort. But recognizing the strategy and executing it were two entirely different challenges. The execution required a weapon system that barely existed when the war began. American submarines in 1941 were unreliable, their torpedoes defective, their tactics outdated. Most submarine commanders still thought like surface ship captains, fighting honorable engagements and following prize rules that belonged to an earlier century. That was about to change in the most dramatic way possible. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the Pacific Submarine Force, understood that conventional naval warfare would take decades to defeat Japan. Aircraft carriers and battleships could win spectacular victories, but they couldn't strangle an economy. Only submarines could reach into Japan's supply lines and cut them at the source. Only submarines could turn the vast Pacific into a hunting ground where no Japanese vessel was safe. But first, American submariners had to learn how to kill efficiently, and that education began in the blood-soaked waters around the Philippines, where desperate Japanese convoys fought running battles against American wolf packs in some of the most brutal naval combat of the war. Commander Dick O'Kane peers through the periscope of the USS Tang, watching a Japanese convoy steam directly toward his position. 7 cargo ships, 2 destroyers, and enough firepower to blow his submarine to pieces if they spot him first. It's October 1944, and O'Kane has already sunk more Japanese shipping than any other submarine commander in the Pacific. But this attack will be different. This time, he's not just hunting individual ships, he's targeting an entire convoy carrying supplies that could keep Japanese forces fighting for months. The mathematics of submarine warfare are brutally simple. A single torpedo costs $10,000 and weighs 3,000 pounds. A Japanese cargo ship carries supplies worth millions and represents months of irreplaceable production capacity. Sink enough cargo ships, and you don't just win battles. You collapse the enemy's entire war economy. O'Kane adjusts the periscope, calculating distance, speed, and firing solutions with the precision of an accountant. But there's nothing abstract about what's about to happen. When those torpedoes hit, hundreds of Japanese sailors will die in explosions that turn steel ships into floating coffins. The moral calculus of submarine warfare strips away any illusion of honor or glory. This is industrial killing, pure and simple. Fire 1, fire 2, fire 3. The Tang shudders as 3 torpedoes streak toward their targets at 46 knots. O'Kane counts the seconds, watching through his periscope as white wakes draw lines of death across the dark water. Then the first explosion blooms like an orange flower against the lead cargo ship's hull, followed instantly by 2 more that turn the convoy into chaos. Japanese destroyers race toward the Tang's position, their sonar pinging desperately through the water. But O'Kane has already ordered his boat deep, sliding beneath the thermal layer where enemy sonar cannot follow. Above them, Japanese sailors scream for help as their ships settle by the bow, taking with them rice that could have fed thousands, medical supplies that could have saved lives, ammunition that could have prolonged the war. This is how America began to strangle Japan, not with massive fleet engagements or amphibious assaults, but with individual submarines that struck without warning and vanished like predators in the night. By late 1944, the cumulative effect was becoming impossible to ignore. Japanese factories ran out of raw materials, power plants shut down for lack of coal. Civilians lined up for rice rations that grew smaller every week. The psychological impact extended far beyond simple supply shortages. Japanese merchant sailors, once proud members of the world's third-largest merchant marine, began refusing assignments. Shipyards couldn't build vessels fast enough to replace losses. Insurance companies stopped covering Japanese shipping altogether. The entire maritime economy that sustained the Japanese Empire was collapsing under systematic submarine attack. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, received reports that read like medical examinations of a dying patient. Shipping losses exceeded new construction by 300%. Oil imports had dropped to 10% of pre-war levels. Food shipments from occupied territories virtually ceased. Japan was being starved into submission, and there seemed to be no defense against American submarines that appeared everywhere and nowhere. But the submarines were only part of a larger strategy that would prove even more devastating. American code breakers had penetrated Japanese naval communications so completely that submarine commanders often knew convoy routes before the Japanese captains themselves. This intelligence advantage transformed submarine warfare from random hunting into precision surgery, with each attack calculated for maximum economic damage. The human cost of this strategy remained hidden beneath the waves, but it was staggering. Japanese merchant sailors died at rates higher than any other service branch, their ships turned into steel tombs by American torpedoes. Entire communities that depended on maritime trade faced unemployment and starvation. The social fabric of Japanese society began unraveling as the submarine blockade tightened its grip. Yet, perhaps most remarkably, this campaign of economic strangulation was conducted by fewer than 300 American submarines and 16,000 submariners. Never in military history had so few inflicted such comprehensive defeat on so many. The scale and efficiency of the destruction would have been impossible to imagine before the advent of modern submarine technology. Captain Yoshiro Matsuda clutches the bridge rail of his destroyer Hamanami as another merchant ship erupts in flames on the horizon. The fourth vessel lost in 6 hours, each explosion a testament to American submarines lurking beneath these cursed waters. His hands shake not from fear, but from rage at his complete helplessness. 3 years of convoy duty have taught him the terrible mathematics of this war. For every American submarine they sink, 10 more Japanese cargo ships disappear forever. The radio crackles with desperate voices. Mayday calls in broken English. Coordinates scream through static. The sound of men drowning in oil-slicked water while their ships settle toward the ocean floor. Matsuda has heard these sounds so often they've become the soundtrack to his nightmares. But tonight feels different. Tonight, the voices carry a new note of desperation that chills him to the bone. His radar operator looks up from his scope, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool Pacific air. "Captain, we're tracking multiple contacts, at least 6 submarines in a coordinated attack formation. They're hunting us like wolves." American wolfpack tactics had evolved far beyond anything Japanese naval doctrine anticipated. Where individual submarines once stalked lone targets, coordinated groups now surrounded entire convoys like predators isolating prey. Commander Lawson Ramage aboard the USS Parche coordinates his attack with surgical precision, directing 4 other submarines into positions that turn escape routes into killing fields. The Japanese convoy has nowhere to run. Ahead, the USS Harder waits like a spider in its web. To port, the USS Ray tracks targets through her periscope. Starboard brings them into range of the USS Gitaro's torpedo tubes, and behind them, the USS Pargo cuts off any retreat. 5 submarines, 20 torpedo tubes, and enough firepower to send every Japanese ship in the convoy to the bottom within minutes. This isn't warfare, as previous generations understood it. This is extermination conducted with industrial efficiency by men who've learned to kill without seeing their victims' faces. Ramage calculates firing solutions while Japanese sailors eat their final meals, unaware that American torpedoes are already tracking their every movement through the dark water. The first torpedo strikes the lead tanker at exactly 11:47 p.m., rupturing fuel tanks that spread burning petroleum across the waves like liquid hellfire. The explosion illuminates the entire convoy, revealing 7 more Japanese vessels silhouetted against the flames. Perfect targets for submarines that have been waiting in ambush for hours. Commander Matsuda watches his convoy disintegrate with the helpless fury of a man witnessing his own execution. The tanker Kyokuyo Maru breaks in half, her back snapped by explosions that send geysers of burning oil hundreds of feet into the air. The cargo ship Hakusan Maru lists heavily to starboard, her holds flooding with Pacific water that will carry 2,000 tons of rice to the bottom. Medical supplies, ammunition, spare parts for aircraft, all vanishing into the abyss while American submarines reload their torpedo tubes for the next attack. But the psychological warfare proves even more devastating than the physical destruction. Every Japanese merchant sailor knows the statistics. 60% of Japan's merchant marine lies scattered across Pacific coral reefs and abyssal plains. The men who survive convoy runs return to ports where wives wait for husbands who will never come home, where children ask when daddy's ship will dock, where entire families depend on wages that stopped arriving months ago. Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka, age 22, writes his final letter home as water pours through the torpedo hole in his ship's hull. The letter will never be mailed, but American divers will recover it years later from the wreckage. His words capture the quiet desperation that gripped Japan's merchant marine in late 1944. Honored Mother, the Americans have found us again. Our ship is sinking, and I do not think rescue will come. Please tell Michiko that I tried to bring the medicine her village needs. Tell Father that I died serving the Emperor. But mostly, tell them that the ocean has become our enemy, and we cannot fight water itself. The ocean had indeed become Japan's enemy, but not through any natural disaster. American submarines had transformed the Pacific into a hunting ground where Japanese shipping faced systematic extinction. Every major sea lane buzzed with sonar contacts and torpedo wakes. Every island stronghold watched supply convoys vanish before reaching harbor. Every factory on the home islands ran shorter shifts as raw materials became memories. Admiral Koshiro Oikawa, studying shipping reports in his Tokyo headquarters, confronted numbers that defied comprehension. Monthly sinkings now exceeded Japan's entire pre-war construction capacity. The merchant marine that once connected an empire stretching from Manchuria to the Solomon Islands had been reduced to coastal fishing boats too small for American submarines to waste torpedoes on. The ripple effects cascaded through Japanese society like shock waves from underwater explosions. Steel mills shut down for lack of iron ore. Aircraft factories ceased production when aluminum supplies dried up. Textile plants closed when cotton shipments stopped arriving from occupied territories. The industrial economy that sustained Japan's military machine was suffocating one sinking ship at a time. Civilians felt the strangulation most acutely in their rice bowls. Government rations dropped from adequate to survival level as cargo ships carrying food from Korea and Formosa joined the growing underwater graveyard of Japanese merchant shipping. Black market prices soared beyond the reach of working families. Children's growth stunted from malnutrition that no amount of patriotic rhetoric could cure. Dr. Takeshi Yamamoto, a pediatrician in Osaka, documented the medical consequences of America's submarine blockade in clinical reports that read like horror stories. Vitamin deficiency diseases appeared in children born during the war. Tuberculosis rates climbed as weakened immune systems succumbed to infections. Infant mortality increased month by month as expectant mothers lacked adequate nutrition. The doctor's notes, preserved in hospital archives, provide chilling testimony to the effectiveness of economic warfare. Patient exhibits symptoms consistent with severe protein deficiency. Mother reports family rice ration reduced again this week. Father lost job when steel plant closed due to ore shortages. This child represents the physical manifestation of our nation's starvation. Yet even as Japan's home islands withered under submarine blockade, the American campaign intensified. New submarines joined the Pacific Fleet monthly, their crews trained in tactics perfected through 2 years of trial and error. Advanced sonar systems detected targets at unprecedented ranges. Improved torpedoes exploded with devastating reliability. Intelligence networks provided submarine commanders with shipping schedules more accurate than those available to Japanese convoy commodores. The USS Archerfish prowls the waters off Tokyo Bay like a mechanical shark, her crew scanning the horizon for the ultimate prize. Japanese naval intelligence has detected increased radio traffic, suggesting a major fleet movement. But they don't know that American code breakers have already intercepted and decoded every message. They don't know that the largest aircraft carrier in the world is steaming directly toward a carefully planned ambush. Commander Joe Enright, studies the intelligence reports with professional satisfaction. After months of hunting cargo ships and tankers, his submarine finally has a chance at a target worthy of its capabilities. The Shinano, Japan's newest and largest carrier, represents 2 years of construction effort and millions of man-hours of skilled labor. Sink her, and Japan loses not just a ship, but the irreplaceable expertise of trained carrier personnel. The mathematics of this hunt are staggering. The Shinano displaces 72,000 tons, making her the largest warship ever built. Her construction consumed steel that could have built dozens of destroyers, aluminum that could have produced hundreds of aircraft, and skilled labor that Japan can never replace. More importantly, she carries 1,400 trained naval personnel whose experience represents decades of institutional knowledge. Sink the Shinano, and Japan loses far more than just another ship. Enright positions his submarine along the carrier's projected course, using intelligence so precise it seems almost supernatural. American code breakers haven't just penetrated Japanese naval communications. They've essentially become invisible members of the Japanese naval staff. Every convoy route, every departure time, every defensive measure is known to American submarine commanders before Japanese sailors weigh anchor. The carrier appears on the horizon at exactly the predicted time, her massive bulk cutting through the Pacific swells like a floating city. Destroyer escorts screen her flanks, their sonar sweeping desperately for threats they'll never detect in time. The Shinano's captain believes his ship is too large, too well defended, too valuable for the Americans to find. He's about to learn that size only makes submarines' targeting solutions easier. 6 torpedoes streak through the dark water at 46 knots, their wakes invisible against the moonless night. The first explosion tears a hole in the Shinano's hull large enough to drive a truck through. The second buckles her flight deck. The third floods her forward magazines with seawater that will drag 72,000 tons of Japanese naval power to the ocean floor. Captain Toshio Abe watches his ship die with the stunned disbelief of a man witnessing the impossible. The Shinano was supposed to be unsinkable, her compartmentalized design capable of surviving multiple torpedo hits. Instead, she's settling by the bow like any ordinary cargo vessel, her death throes illuminated by fires that can be seen for miles. In 4 hours, Japan's mightiest warship will become another entry in American submarine war diaries. But the Shinano's destruction represents more than tactical victory. Her sinking announces to the world that Japanese naval power has become an illusion maintained only by increasingly desperate propaganda. If America's submarines can reach the Emperor's newest carrier in home waters, no Japanese vessel anywhere is safe. The psychological impact reverberates through the combined fleet like shock waves from underwater explosions. The human cost extends far beyond military casualties. Every sinking ship carried supplies that Japanese civilians needed to survive. Medicine for hospitals, food for cities, raw materials for the factories that employed millions. The submarine blockade wasn't just strangling Japan's military, it was methodically destroying the economic foundation of an entire society. Factory worker Hiroshi Sato stares at the notice posted outside the Mitsubishi plant in Nagoya, his lunch pail trembling in weathered hands. The foundry is closing indefinitely due to raw material shortages. After 16 years of steady employment, he's joining the growing ranks of industrial workers whose jobs have vanished beneath the Pacific, along with the cargo ships that once sustained Japan's economy. Sato's story multiplied across Japan as the submarine blockade tightened its grip. Shipyards fell silent when steel stopped arriving from Manchuria. Textile mills shuttered when cotton imports ceased. Aircraft factories suspended production as aluminum became more precious than gold. The industrial ecosystem that had transformed Japan from feudal society to modern power was systematically dismantled by American submarines operating thousands of miles from the home islands. The social consequences proved equally devastating. Unemployment climbed to levels not seen since the Great Depression. Families that had prospered during the early war years faced destitution as breadwinners lost jobs in industries starved of raw materials. Government ration cards became worthless when there was nothing left to ration. Dr. Michiko Tanaka, a social worker in Tokyo, documented the collapse in reports that painted a picture of a society unraveling. Families abandoned their homes in industrial cities, seeking relatives in rural areas where subsistence farming might provide survival. Children stopped attending school to scavenge for food. Elderly citizens, too proud to beg, simply disappeared from their neighborhoods, their fate unrecorded in official statistics. The submarine campaign had achieved something no conventional military force could accomplish. It had turned Japan's greatest strategic asset, her island geography, into a fatal vulnerability. The same waters that had protected Japan from invasion for centuries now formed an impassable barrier that prevented essential supplies from reaching the home islands. Commander Eugene Fluckey surfaces his submarine in the pre-dawn darkness, studying the burning wreckage of another Japanese convoy through his binoculars. 5 cargo ships, 2 tankers, and a destroyer lie scattered across 10 miles of Pacific Ocean, their hulks settling toward the abyssal depths with their precious cargoes intact. Oil spreads across the water like black blood, carrying with it Japan's ability to fuel her remaining warships. By August 1945, the mathematics of strangulation were complete. American submarines had sunk over 1,300 Japanese merchant vessels, reducing the world's third-largest merchant marine to scattered coastal fishing boats. An island empire that once controlled half the Pacific had been suffocated by fewer than 300 submarines and 16,000 submariners, who proved that modern warfare isn't won by the bravest soldiers, but by those who understand that cutting supply lines kills nations more efficiently than any battlefield victory. In the end, Japan surrendered not to American bombs, but to American submarines that had turned the vast Pacific into Japan's grave. The morning fog clings to Pearl Harbor like a shroud as Lieutenant Commander Eugene Fluckey peers through his periscope at the Japanese merchant convoy steaming toward Formosa. It's March 1945, and the USS Barb sits motionless 60 feet below the surface, her crew of 80 men holding their breath in perfect silence. Above them, 4 enemy destroyers prowl the waters like hunting wolves, their sonar pinging through the darkness. Fluckey adjusts the periscope's focus, counting the targets. 7 cargo ships loaded with supplies for Japan's crumbling empire, fuel, ammunition, food, medicine, everything the Japanese war machine desperately needs to continue fighting. His finger hovers over the firing control as sweat drips down his face in the stifling submarine heat. But here's what makes this moment absolutely extraordinary. This isn't just another submarine patrol. This is the climax of the most devastating naval campaign in military history. A 3-year underwater war that strangled an entire empire and brought Japan to its knees before the atomic bombs ever fell. Most people think World War II in the Pacific was won by aircraft carriers and Marines storming beaches. They're wrong. The real war, the war that actually decided everything, was fought in the crushing depths of the Pacific by men who volunteered for the most dangerous duty in the American military. Picture this. At the start of the war, Japan controlled an empire stretching from the Aleutian Islands to the edge of Australia. 6,000 miles of conquered territory defended by the world's most powerful navy. Their merchant fleet of over 6 million tons carried the raw materials that fed their war machine: oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaysia, iron from China, rice from Korea. Japan was a fortress supplied by an endless stream of cargo ships. The Japanese thought they were untouchable. Their surface fleet had humiliated the British at Singapore and crushed the Americans at Pearl Harbor. Their aircraft dominated the skies from Wake Island to the Philippines. They had every reason to believe their Pacific empire would last 1,000 years. They had no idea that beneath the waves, a small force of American submarines was about to methodically destroy everything they'd built. When Admiral Chester Nimitz took command of the Pacific Fleet after Pearl Harbor, he inherited exactly 51 operational submarines, 51 boats to take on the entire Japanese empire. The Japanese had over 400 warships, thousands of aircraft, and millions of troops. The math seemed impossible, but Nimitz understood something the Japanese didn't. Wars aren't won by conquering territory. They're won by destroying your enemy's ability to fight. And Japan's ability to fight depended entirely on those merchant ships carrying supplies across the Pacific. Cut those supply lines, and the mighty Japanese empire becomes a collection of isolated islands, slowly starving to death. The problem was American submarines in 1941 were a disaster waiting to happen. Their torpedoes were defective, exploding prematurely or failing to detonate at all. Their commanders were trained for World War I tactics that had no relevance to Pacific warfare. Their doctrine emphasized following international law over sinking enemy ships. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton of the USS Wahoo changed everything. On his first patrol in January 1943, Morton threw out the rulebook and began hunting Japanese ships like a predator stalking prey. He surfaced at night to attack convoys with deck guns. He pursued damaged ships relentlessly. He machine-gunned survivors in the water, breaking every rule of civilized warfare. His crew was horrified at first. This wasn't the clean, honorable combat they'd trained for. This was something darker, more brutal. But when the Wahoo returned to Pearl Harbor flying a broom from her periscope, signaling a clean sweep of enemy ships, everything changed. Morton's success proved that submarine warfare in the Pacific wasn't about honor or rules. It was about killing Japanese ships as efficiently as possible. And the most efficient way to do that was to abandon every principle of civilized combat and fight like pirates. Within months, American submarine commanders across the Pacific were adopting Morton's ruthless tactics. They learned to attack at night when their radar gave them an overwhelming advantage. They discovered that Japanese anti-submarine warfare was primitive compared to German U-boat hunters. Most importantly, they realized that the vast Pacific Ocean was actually perfect hunting ground for submarines willing to operate without mercy. The Japanese never saw it coming. Their merchant captains had sailed these routes for decades without serious threat. Their naval escorts were designed to fight surface ships, not hunt submarines. Their anti-submarine technology was years behind American radar and sonar systems. Commander Richard O'Kane of the USS Tang perfected the art of night surface attacks, using his submarine speed and maneuverability to devastating effect. In one patrol, he sank 10 Japanese ships in 18 days, destroying over 39,000 tons of shipping. The Japanese called him the Ghost of the Pacific because his attacks seemed to come from nowhere. But the real breakthrough came when American submarines began coordinating their attacks. Instead of operating alone, They formed wolf packs that could track and destroy entire convoys. 3 or 4 submarines working together could eliminate a dozen merchant ships in a single night, leaving the ocean littered with burning wreckage and Japanese survivors. The psychological impact on Japanese merchant sailors was devastating. Men who had spent their lives carrying cargo across peaceful seas suddenly found themselves targets in a war they barely understood. Ships that left port never arrived at their destinations. Convoys that should have taken a week to cross the Pacific disappeared without a trace. Japanese cargo capacity began dropping at an alarming rate. In 1942, they lost 1.2 million tons of shipping. In 1943, that number doubled to 2.4 million tons. By 1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant ships faster than Japan could build them. The strangling of Japan had begun. Commander Samuel Dealey of the USS Harda took submarine warfare to its logical extreme. He didn't just hunt merchant ships. He hunted the destroyers sent to protect them. In one legendary patrol, he sank 5 Japanese destroyers in 4 days, proving that American submarines could take on Japan's most powerful warships and win. The Japanese Admiralty was in panic. Their merchant fleet was hemorrhaging ships at an unsustainable rate. Their destroyer forces were being decimated by submarines they couldn't catch. Their supply lines to the conquered territories were breaking down completely. But the Americans were just getting started. New submarines were rolling off assembly lines in record numbers. Advanced radar and sonar systems gave them unprecedented tactical advantages. Most importantly, they had developed a generation of submarine commanders who understood that winning meant abandoning every rule of civilized warfare. The Japanese Empire was about to discover that their island fortress was only as strong as the ships that supplied it. And those ships were being systematically hunted to extinction by American submarines operating with ruthless efficiency in the vast darkness of the Pacific Ocean. What happened next would transform submarine warfare forever and bring the Japanese Empire to the brink of total collapse. The underwater hunters were about to become the apex predators of the Pacific War. The numbers tell a story that even the most optimistic Japanese admiral couldn't ignore. By late 1944, American submarines had sunk over 4 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping. To put that in perspective, that's equivalent to destroying every cargo ship that entered American ports for an entire year. Japan's industrial production was collapsing not from bombing, but from starvation. Lieutenant Commander Lawson Ramage of the USS Parch understood the mathematics of empire destruction better than most. On a sweltering August night in 1944, he surfaced his submarine in the middle of a Japanese convoy and proceeded to conduct what can only be described as maritime murder. For over an hour, the Parche raced through the convoy at flank speed, firing torpedoes and deck guns at point-blank range. When the smoke cleared, Ramage had sunk 4 ships and damaged 3 others. But more importantly, he had demonstrated that American submarines no longer feared Japanese surface forces. They were the hunters now, and the entire Japanese merchant marine had become their prey. The psychological transformation was complete. American submariners who had entered the war as reluctant warriors emerged as cold-blooded killers who measured success in tons of enemy shipping sent to the bottom. They developed a professional detachment that would have horrified their peacetime selves. Japanese merchant sailors weren't enemies to be fought honorably. They were targets to be eliminated efficiently. Commander Eugene Fluckey embodied this transformation perfectly. The man who would become known as Lucky Flucky approached submarine warfare like a chess master, thinking 3 moves ahead of his Japanese opponents. He studied shipping patterns, analyzed convoy routes, and positioned his submarine not where Japanese ships were, but where they would be. In December 1944, Fluckey took the USS Barb into the East China Sea and proceeded to rewrite the rules of submarine warfare. He didn't just attack ships at sea, he followed them into harbors, penetrated heavily defended anchorages, and sank them at their moorings. When the Japanese moved their ships to shallow coastal waters where submarines supposedly couldn't operate, Fluckey took his boat into waters so shallow that his periscope nearly scraped the bottom. The Japanese had no answer for this level of aggression. Their anti-submarine tactics assumed American commanders would follow established naval doctrine. They never imagined facing submariners who would surface in broad daylight to shell coastal installations or penetrate minefields that were supposed to be impenetrable. But the most devastating innovation came from an unlikely source. Commander Charles Lockwood, commanding Pacific Fleet submarines, realized that American boats were operating in a target-rich environment with unlimited opportunities. The problem wasn't finding Japanese ships to sink. It was having enough torpedoes to sink them all. The solution was elegantly simple and utterly ruthless. Instead of trying to sink every ship they encountered, American submarines began targeting the most valuable vessels first. Tankers carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies received priority over cargo ships carrying rice. Ammunition ships took precedence over troop transports. The goal wasn't just to sink Japanese shipping, but to eliminate the most critical supplies first. This strategic targeting had a cascading effect throughout the Japanese Empire. Without fuel oil, the Japanese combined fleet became a collection of expensive anchored monuments. Without ammunition, Japanese garrisons across the Pacific ran short of shells and bullets. Without food imports, the Japanese home islands began experiencing genuine hunger for the first time since the medieval period. The isolation was becoming complete. Japanese soldiers on bypassed Pacific islands found themselves cut off from resupply, slowly starving as American submarines picked off any ship brave enough to attempt a relief mission. The great Japanese fortress in the Pacific was becoming a prison, with American submarines as the jailers. Captain Dick O'Kane pushed this campaign to its ultimate expression during his final patrol aboard the USS Tang in October 1944. In the waters off Formosa, he encountered the largest Japanese convoy of the war. 24 merchant ships protected by destroyers, cruisers, and aircraft. Any rational submarine commander would have reported the convoy's position and withdrawn to safety. O'Kane attacked immediately. For 3 days and nights, the Tang stalked the convoy like a wolf hunting a herd of sheep. O'Kane picked off stragglers, ambushed ships that broke formation, and systematically destroyed the convoy's protective screen. When Japanese destroyers closed in for the kill, he dove deep and used the convoy's own ships as shields. By the time it was over, O'Kane had sunk or damaged over half the convoy. The Tang herself was finally sunk by one of her own torpedoes that ran in a circle, but O'Kane had proven that a single American submarine could neutralize an entire Japanese fleet if commanded with sufficient ruthlessness. The Japanese merchant marine was in free fall. Ships that had once carried the wealth of conquered Asia to Japan now lay scattered across the Pacific floor. Experienced captains refused to take their vessels beyond sight of land. Crews deserted rather than face another voyage through waters patrolled by American submarines. Japan's industrial production statistics tell the story with mathematical precision. Steel production dropped by 60%. Aircraft manufacturing fell by 75%. Ammunition production virtually ceased as raw materials stopped arriving from overseas territories. The Japanese war machine was grinding to a halt, not from direct attack, but from systematic starvation. But the American submarine campaign was about to reach its climactic phase. In early 1945, with Japan's merchant fleet reduced to scattered remnants, American submarines began the final strangling of the Japanese Empire. They moved their operations into Japanese home waters, hunting the last remaining ships within sight of Mount Fuji itself. The hunters had become apex predators, and their prey was running out of places to hide. What happened next would demonstrate just how completely American submarines had transformed the Pacific War from a contest between surface fleets into an underwater massacre that left Japan defenseless and starving. The final phase of Japan's destruction began with a single submarine slipping through the Tsugaru Strait under cover of darkness. Commander Eugene Fluckey had brought the USS Barb into the most heavily defended waters in the Japanese Empire, threading through minefields and patrol boats to reach the sacred hunting grounds that no American submarine had dared enter before. This wasn't just another patrol. This was the beginning of the end for Japan itself. The home islands, protected by centuries of oceanic isolation, were about to discover that their natural moat had become a killing ground for American submarines operating with absolute impunity. Fluckey's target wasn't some distant convoy or isolated transport. He was hunting the Karafuto Maru, a massive ferry carrying 2,400 Japanese civilians and soldiers between the home islands. The ship represented everything Japan still believed it could protect: families fleeing the advancing Soviets, wounded veterans returning home, children who had never seen war except in propaganda posters. None of that mattered to Fluckey. The Karafuto Maru was a legitimate military target carrying enemy personnel, and the USS Barb had 4 torpedoes with her name written on them. The attack came at dawn on August 22, 1945. Fluckey's torpedoes struck the ferry amidships, breaking her back and sending her to the bottom in less than 4 minutes. Over 600 Japanese died in the icy waters, including dozens of children whose only crime was being born on the wrong side of the Pacific War. But here's what made this sinking absolutely extraordinary. It happened 6 days after Japan had already surrendered. The war was officially over, yet American submarines were still hunting Japanese ships like sharks in a feeding frenzy. The killing had developed its own momentum that couldn't be stopped even by imperial decree. The psychological impact on Japan was devastating. Their emperor had surrendered. Their cities lay in ruins. Yet American submarines continued prowling their coastal waters like mechanical sharks. The message was unmistakable. Japan wasn't just defeated, they were completely helpless. Their island fortress had become an American hunting preserve. Lieutenant Commander William Thompson of the USS Tigrone epitomized this final phase of submarine warfare. In the weeks before Japan's surrender, he took his boat into Tokyo Bay itself, surfacing within sight of the Imperial Palace to shell coastal installations. Japanese civilians watching from shore couldn't believe what they were seeing. An enemy submarine operating with casual arrogance in waters that should have been absolutely secure. The numbers from this final campaign are staggering. In the last 6 months of the war, American submarines sank over 400 Japanese vessels, totaling more than 800,000 tons. But these weren't the massive cargo ships of earlier campaigns. These were fishing boats, coastal ferries, small cargo vessels trying to move supplies between the home islands. Japan was being murdered, one small ship at a time. Commander James Blanchard of the USS Albacore understood the strategic implications better than most. His patrol reports from early 1945 read, like the observations of a scientist studying the death of an ecosystem. Japanese shipping had become so sparse that his submarine could patrol for days without finding a target worth a torpedo. The merchant marine that had once fed an empire had been reduced to scattered remnants hiding in shallow coastal waters. The Japanese tried everything to keep their remaining ships alive. They painted hospital markings on cargo vessels, hoping American submarines would respect international law. They moved supplies by night in small boats that hugged the coastline. They even attempted to disguise warships as hospital ships, fishing vessels, anything that might avoid attracting submarine attention. Nothing worked. American submarine commanders had spent 3 years learning to identify Japanese deception tactics. They could spot a disguised warship from miles away, distinguish between legitimate hospital ships and military transports, track coastal shipping patterns with mathematical precision. The hunter-killer teams had evolved into something approaching perfection. They operated with the cold efficiency of industrial machinery, processing Japanese shipping through a mechanical death system that left no room for mercy or mistake. Captain Roy Benson of the USS Trigger demonstrated this evolution during his final patrol in March 1945. Instead of hunting individual ships, he positioned his submarine along the main shipping route between Korea and Japan and simply waited. For 12 days, the Trigger remained submerged in the same position, methodically destroying every vessel that passed through Benson's killing zone. Cargo ships, tankers, fishing boats, military transports, even hospital ships that couldn't prove their legitimacy. Benson's crew developed a routine that resembled factory work more than naval combat. Identify target, calculate firing solution, launch torpedoes, dive to avoid counterattack. Surface to confirm kill, repeat process. By the time the Trigger returned to base, Benson had sunk 14 Japanese vessels without moving more than 5 miles from his original position. He had transformed submarine warfare into an assembly line for destroying enemy shipping. The Japanese home islands were experiencing genuine starvation for the first time in their recorded history. Rice imports from Korea had virtually ceased. Oil shipments from the conquered territories had stopped completely. Even fishing boats were being sunk by American submarines that could no longer distinguish between military and civilian targets because the distinction had become meaningless. Commander Morton Mumma of the USS Sailfish captured the psychology of this final campaign in his patrol report from July 1945. "We are no longer fighting a war," he wrote. "We are conducting an extermination. The Japanese merchant marine has ceased to exist as an effective force. What remains are scattered survivors attempting to avoid inevitable destruction." The mathematical precision of American submarine warfare had reduced Japan to a collection of isolated islands slowly dying from industrial starvation. Their steel production had fallen to 15% of pre-war levels. Aircraft manufacturing had essentially stopped. Ammunition factories sat idle because the raw materials they needed lay at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. But the most devastating effect was psychological. The Japanese people had believed their island fortress was impregnable. They had trusted their navy to protect the sea lanes that connected them to their empire. They had assumed their technological superiority would overcome any enemy challenge. Instead, they discovered that American submarines had turned their protective ocean into a graveyard. Every ship that attempted to reach Japan faced almost certain destruction. Every cargo vessel that left port knew it was entering a hunting ground patrolled by predators that showed no mercy and followed no rules except efficiency. The great Japanese Empire of the Pacific, built on naval supremacy and oceanic conquest, was being systematically strangled by fewer than 300 American submarines operating with ruthless precision in waters the Japanese had once considered their private lake. When Emperor Hirohito finally surrendered in August 1945, Japan had lost over 8.5 million tons of merchant shipping to American submarines. That represented 85% of their pre-war cargo capacity. The island nation that had once controlled half the Pacific Ocean couldn't feed its own people or supply its own industries. The underwater war had accomplished what no surface fleet could achieve. It had transformed the mighty Japanese empire into a starving collection of isolated islands, completely cut off from the resources they needed to continue fighting. American submarines had won the Pacific War not through glorious surface battles or heroic amphibious assaults, but through the patient, methodical destruction of Japan's ability to exist as an industrial power. They had proven that modern warfare wasn't about conquering territory or winning battles. It was about strangling your enemy's economy so completely that resistance becomes impossible. The submariners who accomplished this victory returned home as quiet heroes, their achievements overshadowed by the more visible exploits of aircraft carriers and marine divisions. But they had fundamentally changed naval warfare forever, proving that a small force of determined professionals could destroy an entire empire if they were willing to abandon every principle of civilized combat and fight with the cold efficiency of industrial machinery. The Pacific Ocean had become an American lake, patrolled by submarines that had learned to kill without conscience or hesitation. Japan's island fortress had become their prison, and the keys belonged to men who had transformed submarine warfare into the most devastating naval campaign in human history. The war ended not with the thunder of naval gunfire or the roar of aircraft engines, but with the silent efficiency of American submarines that had methodically strangled an empire beneath the waves. When the Japanese finally surrendered in August 1945, they weren't just defeated by atomic bombs or invasion threats. They were starving. Their merchant fleet lay scattered across the Pacific floor, their supply lines severed, their industrial capacity reduced to nothing. Lieutenant Commander Fluckey and his fellow submarine commanders had accomplished something unprecedented in military history. With fewer than 300 boats, they had destroyed over 8.5 million tons of enemy shipping and reduced the mighty Japanese empire to isolated islands, slowly dying from starvation. They had proven that wars aren't won by the largest armies or the most advanced weapons, but by cutting the economic lifelines that keep nations alive. The men who fought this underwater campaign returned home as quiet heroes, their achievements overshadowed by more visible victories. But they had fundamentally changed warfare forever. They showed the world that a small force of professionals, operating with ruthless efficiency and absolute determination, could bring the most powerful empire to its knees. The Pacific War was won not on distant beaches or in carrier battles, but in the crushing depths of the ocean by men who understood that sometimes victory requires abandoning honor for effectiveness. The underwater war that strangled Japan remains the most devastating naval campaign in human history, and its lessons echo through every conflict that followed.
Picture this. It's dawn on June 4th, 1942. The Pacific Ocean stretches endlessly in every direction, its surface deceptively calm in the pre-morning darkness. 240 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stands on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, studying intelligence reports with growing confidence. Behind him, the most powerful naval strike force in history cuts through the water. 4 aircraft carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, 272 of Japan's finest aircraft. pilots who have never known defeat across the Pacific. But 200 miles to his northeast, something unprecedented is happening in naval warfare. Something that will shatter every assumption the Japanese Navy holds about American fighting capability. Admiral Raymond Spruance peers through his binoculars from the bridge of USS Enterprise, watching his flight crews prepare for what most of his pilots believe is a suicide mission. These aren't the weekend warriors Japan expects. These are men who've learned hard lessons in the Coral Sea, who've studied Japanese tactics with the cold precision of engineers solving a mechanical problem. What Nagumo doesn't know, what his intelligence reports can't tell him, is that American codebreakers have handed Spruance the most complete picture of enemy intentions in naval history. Every ship position, every attack timing, every strategic objective. The Japanese are sailing into a trap designed by men who understand that winning matters more than honor, that surprise trumps courage, that mathematical precision beats warrior spirit every single time. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey adjusts his flight goggles as he climbs into his SBD Dauntless dive bomber. Around him, 37 other dive bomber pilots are making final preparations for a mission that will either cripple the Japanese Navy or see them all die in the attempt. These men aren't thinking about glory or heroism. They're thinking about fuel calculations, wind drift, target identification under combat conditions. They're approaching warfare like a technical problem that requires technical solutions. What makes this morning extraordinary isn't just the scale of the forces involved. It's the fundamental difference in how each side approaches the coming battle. The Japanese Navy, drunk on 6 months of unbroken victory, expects another demonstration of superior Japanese fighting spirit. Admiral Nagumo has planned this attack like every other. Overwhelming force applied with samurai precision. Strike fast, strike hard, watch the Americans flee or surrender like they have everywhere else in the Pacific. But the Americans have learned something devastating in those early defeats. They've learned that Japanese pilots are mortal, that Japanese carriers can be sunk, that technological superiority means nothing without tactical intelligence, and that tactical intelligence is useless without the precision to exploit it. Most importantly, they've learned that the Japanese expect them to fight like gentlemen warriors, when what the situation demands are cold-blooded killers. The irony is almost poetic. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, designed this entire operation to force a decisive battle that would cripple American naval power permanently. He believed American morale was so shattered by 6 months of defeats that one more crushing victory would bring them to the negotiating table. What he couldn't foresee was that those defeats had taught American commanders something more valuable than victory. They had taught them how to think like their enemy while fighting like themselves. Spruance studies the plot board, showing Japanese positions with the methodical calm of a chess master who can see 8 moves ahead. His task force commanders, Admirals Fletcher and Browning, have spent weeks wargaming this exact scenario. They know where the Japanese will be before the Japanese know where they're going. They understand Nagumo's attack patterns better than Nagumo understands American defensive capabilities. Most critically, they've positioned their forces not where Japanese doctrine expects them, but where mathematical analysis of flight ranges and fuel consumption indicates they need to be for maximum tactical advantage. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading Bombing Squadron 6, runs through his attack sequence one final time. Dive angle, airspeed, release altitude, recovery procedures. His squadron has practiced these maneuvers until they can execute them in their sleep, until technical precision has become muscle memory. What the Japanese see as mechanical, soulless warfare, the Americans have embraced as their greatest tactical advantage. They're not trying to outspirit the Japanese. They're trying to outthink them, outcalculate them, out-engineer them. The fundamental miscalculation driving Japanese strategy runs deeper than tactical intelligence. Admiral Nagumo believes he's facing the same demoralized American forces that scattered at Pearl Harbor, that abandoned Wake Island, that surrendered in the Philippines. His combat doctrine assumes American pilots will break under pressure, that American commanders will hesitate at crucial moments, that American fighting spirit will crumble when confronted with superior Japanese determination. What he cannot comprehend is that those early defeats forged American naval aviation into something entirely different. These pilots have seen their friends die because of tactical mistakes. They've watched Japanese Zeros outmaneuver American fighters because American doctrine emphasized individual heroics over coordinated tactics. They've learned that war isn't about courage. It's about making the other guy die for his country while you go home alive to yours. Commander John Thatch, leading Fighting Squadron 3, has developed entirely new fighter tactics based on mathematical analysis of Japanese Zero capabilities. His Thatch Weave formation doesn't try to outturn Japanese fighters. Instead, it uses geometric principles to create mutual support situations where American numerical superiority and heavier armament can negate Japanese maneuverability advantages. This isn't Bushido. This is engineering applied to aerial combat. But the real revolution in American naval thinking goes beyond tactics. It's psychological. Admiral Halsey's famous order before the Doolittle raid captured the new American mindset perfectly. Kill Japs, kill Japs, kill more Japs. This isn't about honor or glory or demonstrating national character. This is about systematic elimination of enemy forces using whatever methods prove most effective. The Americans have stopped trying to fight like gentlemen and started fighting like exterminators. As morning light begins filtering across the Pacific, both fleets are converging on coordinates that will determine the course of the war. Admiral Nagumo, supremely confident in Japanese superiority, has divided his attack force to strike both Midway Island and any American naval forces that might appear. His aircraft are armed with land attack bombs because his intelligence suggests no American carriers are in the area. His combat air patrol is positioned to defend against expected American land-based aircraft attacks. Every decision reflects Japanese assumptions about American capabilities and intentions. Assumptions that are about to prove catastrophically wrong. Because 200 miles away, Spruance's task force is launching the most precisely coordinated carrier strike in naval history. Not the largest, not the most powerful, but the most mathematically calculated to exploit every weakness in Japanese defensive positioning. The American pilots climbing into their aircraft this morning aren't heroes from propaganda posters. They're technicians of destruction who've reduced aerial combat to ballistics calculations and fuel consumption rates. They know exactly where the Japanese carriers will be, because American codebreakers have given them the enemy's complete operational plan. They know exactly when to strike, because intelligence analysis has identified the precise moment when Japanese aircraft will be rearming and refueling on their flight decks. Most importantly, they know something Admiral Nagumo cannot imagine. That American naval doctrine has evolved beyond recognition in 6 months of defeat. That the men he's about to face have learned to fight not like the Americans who lost at Pearl Harbor, but like an entirely different breed of warrior. Professionals who understand that precision matters more than courage, that coordination trumps individual heroics, that systematic destruction beats honorable combat every single time. The next 4 hours will prove that assumption correct in the most devastating way possible. At 6 a.m., the first American scout planes lift off from Enterprise and Hornet, their engines cutting through the dawn silence like mechanical prayers. These aren't glory-seeking fighter jocks. These are reconnaissance specialists who understand that information is the deadliest weapon in their arsenal. Their mission is brutally simple. Find the Japanese carriers before Japanese scouts find them. In aerial warfare, the side that strikes first usually strikes last. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon banks his SBD Dauntless into a climbing turn. his radioman scanning the horizon through high-powered binoculars. They're flying a search pattern calculated to intersect Japanese approach routes at the exact moment when enemy carriers should be launching their midway strike. This isn't guesswork. This is mathematical prediction based on decoded intelligence that tells them more about Japanese intentions than most Japanese officers know themselves. What these American pilots don't realize is that they're about to witness something unprecedented in naval warfare: the systematic destruction of a battle fleet by forces that shouldn't theoretically be able to touch them. Admiral Nagumo's carriers are protected by the finest fighter pilots in the world, defended by the most experienced anti-aircraft crews in any navy, surrounded by battleships and cruisers whose combined firepower could level a city. But none of that matters when your enemy knows exactly where you'll be and exactly when you'll be most vulnerable. At 6:15 a.m., Lieutenant William Brockman in the submarine USS Nautilus spots smoke on the horizon. Not just any smoke, the distinctive black exhaust of Japanese warships running at high speed. Through his periscope, he counts 4 aircraft carriers in perfect formation, their flight decks busy with aircraft operations. This is the target every American commander has been dreaming of since Pearl Harbor, the heart of Japanese naval aviation, concentrated in one killable formation. Brockman's contact report crackles through American radio networks with electrifying urgency. 4 carriers bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles, course southeast, speed 25 knots. Within minutes, every American pilot knows exactly where to find the enemy. More importantly, they know the Japanese haven't spotted American forces yet. The element of surprise remains intact. Meanwhile, Admiral Nagumo receives his own intelligence reports, and they paint a picture of complete American confusion. Midway's defenses are scattered and ineffective. No American carriers detected in the operational area. His strike force has achieved total surprise. In 2 hours, his aircraft will reduce Midway to smoking rubble, clearing the way for Japanese invasion forces. Victory seems mathematically certain. What Nagumo cannot see is the swarm of American aircraft now converging on his position from 3 different carrier task forces: 116 dive bombers, 67 torpedo bombers, 83 fighters. Not flying in the scattered individual attacks that Japanese doctrine expects, but in carefully coordinated waves designed to overwhelm defensive systems through sheer mathematical precision. Commander John Waldron leads Torpedo Squadron 8 off the deck of USS Hornet, his 15 TBD Devastators flying barely 50 feet above the ocean surface. These are obsolete aircraft, flying coffins that can barely keep pace with modern fighters. Their torpedoes are so unreliable that successful hits are more luck than skill. By any rational military analysis, this attack should fail catastrophically. But Waldron isn't thinking about rational military analysis. He's thinking about timing. His torpedo bombers are designed to force Japanese fighters down to sea level, where diving bombers can attack from high altitude without fighter interference. His squadron is expendable. Their deaths will create the tactical opening that allows American dive bombers to destroy their targets. This is warfare reduced to its most brutal mathematical equation: acceptable losses in pursuit of mission objectives. Waldron and his men are about to die so that other Americans can live and win. They know it, accept it, and fly toward their deaths with the methodical calm of accountants balancing ledgers. At 7:30 a.m., Japanese radar operators detect the first wave of American attackers. Commander Minoru Genda, Nagumo's air operations officer, watches the radar screen with growing alarm. These aren't the scattered, uncoordinated attacks they've encountered throughout the Pacific. This is a systematic assault involving aircraft from multiple carriers, all converging simultaneously on Japanese positions. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval commanders are forced to react to American initiative instead of dictating the terms of engagement. Their carefully planned midway operation suddenly becomes a desperate struggle for survival. Aircraft that should be bombing American installations are instead rearming with anti-ship weapons. Flight decks that should be clear for combat operations are crowded with fuel lines and ordnance. The Americans have achieved something that Japanese military doctrine considered impossible. They've forced the most powerful naval strike force in history into a defensive posture at the moment of maximum vulnerability. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bombers, spots the Japanese formation at exactly 10:22 a.m. 4 carriers in perfect diamond formation, their flight decks packed with aircraft being rearmed and refueled, fuel lines snaking across wooden decks, ordnance stacked beside parked aircraft, aviation gasoline fumes creating an atmosphere so volatile that a single spark could trigger catastrophic explosions. McCluskey keys his radio with surgical precision. This is Enterprise Air Group Leader. 4 enemy carriers sighted, commencing attack runs. His voice carries no emotion, no excitement, no hint of the historical moment unfolding. This is technical communication between professionals, executing a technical solution to a tactical problem. What happens next will be studied in military academies for generations, not as an example of heroic courage, but as a demonstration of what happens when systematic preparation meets perfect timing. The Japanese carriers, caught in the most vulnerable moment of carrier operations, face destruction delivered with mathematical precision by men who've reduced aerial warfare to an engineering problem. Commander Richard Best pushes his SBD Dauntless into a vertical dive toward the carrier Akagi, his bomb sight centered on the ship's forward elevator. At 2,400 feet altitude, traveling at 240 knots, he releases his 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb and pulls out of his dive with G-forces that strain human endurance. Behind him, 36 other dive bombers execute identical attacks with factory-like precision. The Americans aren't fighting like warriors. They're operating like a machine designed for one purpose: converting Japanese aircraft carriers into burning wreckage as efficiently as possible. The mathematics of destruction prove devastatingly simple. At precisely 10:24 a.m., Commander Best's bomb penetrates Akagi's wooden flight deck and detonates in the hangar bay, igniting aviation fuel and stacked ordnance. The explosion doesn't just damage the ship. It transforms Japan's flagship carrier into a floating crematorium. Within seconds, secondary explosions rip through the hangar deck as aviation gasoline ignites aircraft, spare parts, and human beings with equal efficiency. Admiral Nagumo, standing on Akagi's bridge, watches in stunned horror as his perfect formation disintegrates. The Kaga erupts in flames as American bombs find her fuel storage compartments. Soryu lists heavily to starboard, her flight deck a twisted ruin of metal and burning aircraft. In 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers have been reduced from instruments of conquest to floating funeral pyres. But here's what makes this moment historically unprecedented. The Americans aren't celebrating, they're calculating. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey, pulling out of his dive after destroying Akagi, immediately begins plotting attack runs on the surviving carrier Hiryu. His radio crackles with tactical updates, fuel consumption reports, ammunition expenditure data. This isn't emotional warfare. This is industrial killing applied with mechanical precision. Petty Officer Abe Zenji, trapped in Kaga's burning hangar deck, experiences the American transformation firsthand. Through smoke and flames, he watches American dive bombers execute their attacks with systematic ruthlessness. No wild aerobatics, no individual heroics, just methodical target acquisition and bomb delivery that treats Japanese carriers like factory equipment to be dismantled. His final diary entry, recovered weeks later, contains a single haunting observation. They fight like machines that feel nothing. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese personnel proves as devastating as the physical destruction. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, Pearl Harbor strike leader, lies wounded on Akagi's bridge as American bombs transform his ship into hell. Everything he believed about American fighting capability crumbles around him. These aren't the panic-stricken pilots who fled from Japanese fighters 6 months ago. These are systematic executioners who've reduced carrier warfare to mathematical precision. Captain Jisaku Okada, commanding officer of Kaga, makes his final radio transmission as flames consume his bridge. American attack methods completely unexpected. Our defensive doctrine inadequate. They coordinate like single organism. His words capture the fundamental shock rippling through Japanese naval command. American delved beyond recognition, while Japanese strategy remains frozen in assumptions proven catastrophically wrong. Meanwhile, aboard USS Enterprise, Admiral Spruance receives damage reports with the methodical calm of a factory supervisor reviewing production statistics. 3 enemy carriers destroyed, 1 damaged. American losses minimal. Mission parameters exceeded. His staff officers expect celebration, but Spruance's response reflects the new American approach to warfare. Signal all task forces. Prepare for follow-up strikes. The enemy still has 1 operational carrier. This mentality represents everything Japanese military philosophy cannot comprehend. Victory without honor, efficiency without emotion, systematic destruction without personal satisfaction. The Americans have weaponized their own industrial mindset, treating naval combat like assembly line production where the end product is enemy casualties. Lieutenant Commander John Thech, leading the fighter escort, watches Japanese Zero pilots attempt individual combat maneuvers against coordinated American formations. These Japanese aviators are magnificent fighters, their skills honed through years of combat experience. But they're fighting like individual samurai warriors against opponents who've learned to operate like interconnected machinery. American pilots don't try to out-dogfight Japanese Zeros. They use geometric formations and mutual support tactics that negate individual Japanese advantages through collective American strengths. The mathematical brutality becomes even more apparent as surviving Japanese aircraft attempt counterattacks. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, leading the strike from Hiryu against USS Yorktown, faces American defensive systems that operate with computer-like precision. Anti-aircraft fire coordinates through radar guidance systems. Fighter interceptions execute predetermined patterns designed to channel Japanese attackers into killing zones. Even successful Japanese attacks encounter American damage control procedures that seem impossibly efficient. Yeoman Donald Hine, manning a 20mm gun aboard Yorktown, experiences the American transformation from a different perspective. 6 months ago, he was a clerk from Nebraska who'd never seen combat. Now he's operating anti-aircraft weapons with the mechanical precision of factory worker, tracking Japanese dive bombers through calculated lead angles, adjusting for wind drift and target speed like solving mathematical equations. The farm boy who enlisted after Pearl Harbor has become a killing machine, calibrated for maximum efficiency. What terrifies surviving Japanese pilots isn't American courage, it's American coordination. Every defensive system operates in perfect synchronization. Radar operators feed targeting data to gun crews who adjust their fire based on mathematical calculations rather than visual estimation. Fighter pilots execute interception patterns computed for maximum effectiveness rather than individual heroics. The Americans have transformed naval warfare from personal combat into industrial process. Commander Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding Hiryu, recognizes the fundamental shift with crystalline clarity. His final message to Admiral Yamamoto cuts through military euphemism with devastating honesty. Enemy demonstrates unprecedented tactical coordination. Our combat doctrine requires immediate revision. American fighting capability exceeds all intelligence estimates. These aren't the words of a defeated commander making excuses. This is professional assessment from someone who understands that everything has changed. As afternoon shadows lengthen across the Pacific, the scope of American tactical evolution becomes undeniable. Japanese forces that dominated every Pacific engagement for 6 months have been systematically dismantled by opponents they barely recognize. The weekend warriors of Pearl Harbor have become precision instruments of destruction that operate with mechanical efficiency. Japanese military philosophy never imagined possible. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, leading Yorktown's dive bombers against Hiryu, embodies this transformation perfectly. His attack approach follows predetermined mathematical calculations for optimal bomb placement. His radio communications contain no emotion, no personal commentary, just technical data exchange that treats carrier destruction like engineering problem-solving. When his bomb penetrates Hiryu's flight deck and ignites her aviation fuel storage, Leslie's response is purely professional. Target neutralized, returning to base. The final Japanese carrier burns with the same systematic thoroughness that destroyed her sisters. Admiral Nagumo, evacuated from burning Akagi to the cruiser Nagara, stares at 4 columns of smoke, rising from what was once the most powerful naval strike force in history. His intelligence reports never mentioned this American capability. His tactical doctrine never prepared for this level of coordinated precision. Most disturbing of all, his warrior philosophy provides no framework for understanding enemies who fight like emotionless machines. In 4 hours and 22 minutes, American Task Force Precision destroyed 6 months of Japanese Pacific dominance forever. The mathematics were devastatingly simple. 4 Japanese carriers reduced to burning wreckage. 272 elite aircraft eliminated. Japan's most experienced pilots dead or scattered, all accomplished by men who'd learned to fight, not like heroes, but like engineers solving mechanical problems with systematic ruthlessness. The weekend warriors of Pearl Harbor had evolved into something Admiral Nagumo never imagined possible. Professional killers who understood that winning wars requires precision, not honor, coordination rather than courage, and mathematical efficiency instead of warrior spirit. Japan's belief in American weakness died in those flames, and with it, any hope of victory in the Pacific War.
Picture this. It's October 1945, 3 weeks after Japan's surrender. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, American guards watch in stunned silence as Japanese prisoners of war encounter something they've never seen before. Not advanced weapons technology, not American industrial might, something far more mundane yet utterly revolutionary to their understanding of daily life. Hot running water, individual soap bars, private shower stalls with unlimited time limits. Private Hiroshi Tanaka, a 23-year-old former Imperial Navy sailor, stands frozen at the entrance to the shower facility, his eyes wide with disbelief. Behind him, dozens of Japanese POWs whisper among themselves in rapid, excited Japanese. They're not discussing military secrets or escape plans. They're trying to comprehend a level of personal hygiene that seems almost mythical. But here's what makes this story absolutely extraordinary. These aren't rural farmers or isolated mountain villagers. These are educated soldiers, many from Japan's major cities, men who considered themselves representatives of a modern civilized nation. Yet they're about to discover that their understanding of cleanliness exists in a completely different universe from American standards. Sergeant Bill Morrison, the camp's hygiene officer, has seen thousands of prisoners from across the Pacific Theater. German POWs, Italian soldiers, even captured SS officers. But nothing has prepared him for the cultural shock he's witnessing. These Japanese prisoners aren't just surprised by American facilities. They're genuinely confused by the very concept of individual daily bathing. Let me take you inside the mind of these Japanese soldiers and show you exactly what they discovered about American hygiene that challenged everything they thought they knew about cleanliness, civilization, and what it means to be human. The first revelation hits them before they even enter the shower room. Each prisoner receives his own bar of soap, not a communal block to be shared among dozens of men. not a small sliver rationed for the weak. A complete individually wrapped bar of ivory soap that belongs entirely to one person. Lieutenant Kenji Yamada, who commanded a destroyer escort in the Philippine Sea, holds his soap bar like it's made of gold. In his diary, later discovered by American intelligence, he writes with trembling handwriting, "They give each man soap as if it costs nothing." In Japan, such luxury would feed a family for days. But the soap is just the beginning. American